The mahogany doors of courtroom 302 felt heavier than usual as Marcus Johnson pushed them open. His purple heartpin caught the morning light streaming through the high windows, casting a small rainbow on his freshly pressed navy suit. The wooden benches creaked with the shifting weight of the few observers, mostly law students and court regulars who had nothing better to do on a Tuesday morning. Marcus's fingers brushed against the folded papers in his pocket. Testimonials from his therapist, his employer, and fellow veterans who'd watched him rebuild his life piece by piece. Each letter represented a step away from the darkness that had consumed him after Afghanistan, a darkness that had led to the conviction he was now trying to overturn. Judge William Harrison sat like a statue carved from granite, his silver hair and black robes a stark contrast against the pale wood paneling behind him. His reputation preceded him, 20 years on the bench, known for his unwavering adherence to precedent and procedure. The judge's eyes never left his computer screen as Marcus and his lawyer approached the podium. "Your Honor," Marcus's lawyer began, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "We're here today seeking clemency for Mr. Johnson's 2019 conviction. As our petition details, Mr. Johnson's service record is exemplary. 3 tours in Afghanistan, Bronze Star recipient, and—" "Ms. Chin," Judge Harrison interrupted, finally looking up. "I've read the petition. Proceed to your argument." Marcus stood straighter, his military bearing impossible to suppress. He watched as Ms. Chin laid out his case, how the PTSD had gone undiagnosed for months after his medical discharge, how the pills had started as a way to quiet the screams in his head, how he'd sought help the moment he realized he was sliding into the abyss. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she spoke about his work counseling other veterans, his full-time job as a security consultant, his voluntary drug tests, and his speaking engagements at local schools about the dangers of self-medication. Marcus could recite the words by heart. They were his life, his testimony, his truth. Judge Harrison's expression remained unchanged, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on his desk. When Ms. Chin finished, he adjusted his reading glasses and picked up Marcus's file with the deliberate slowness of a man who had already made up his mind. "Mr. Johnson," the judge's voice filled the courtroom, "would you like to address the court?" Marcus stepped forward, his throat suddenly dry. "Your Honor, I know what I did was wrong. I'm not here to make excuses. But the man who committed those crimes, that's not who I am anymore. I've spent every day since trying to prove that one mistake doesn't define a life. And you believe your military service entitles you to special consideration." Harrison's question cut through the air like a blade. "No, sir," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the familiar anger rising in his chest. "I believe my actions since then deserve consideration. The service taught me about responsibility, about fixing what's broken. That's all I'm trying to do." Judge Harrison leaned back, folding his hands over Marcus's file. His next words came out measured and cold. "This court acknowledges your service to our country, Mr. Johnson. However, the law must be applied equally to all citizens. Your military record, while commendable, does not excuse subsequent criminal behavior. The purpose of clemency is not to reward good behavior after the fact, but to correct extraordinary injustices. I find no such injustice here." The gavel's crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, making Marcus flinch despite himself. As Judge Harrison gathered his papers and stood to leave, his parting words hung in the air. "Petition denied. Court is adjourned." Marcus stood motionless at the podium, his purple heartpin suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The security camera feeds flickered across Marcus's laptop screen as he sat in his office at Aegis Protection Services. 6 months had passed since that morning in courtroom 302, but the weight of Judge Harrison's words still pressed against his chest like body armor. He rubbed his tired eyes, focusing on the courthouse blueprints spread across his desk. Another contract, another building that needed protecting from its own demons. His phone buzzed. A text from Tommy, a Marine he'd served with in Afghanistan, now struggling with his own court battle. "Need help with paperwork. You free?" Marcus typed back immediately. "Always free for you, brother." The conviction that Judge Harrison wouldn't erase had become his unofficial credential in the veteran community, proof that he'd walked through the fire and come out the other side. Down the hall, his colleagues discussed risk assessments and patrol rotations, But Marcus's mind wandered to the group session he'd lead tonight. Tuesday nights at the VA had become his sanctuary, a room full of men and women who understood the cost of serving. They didn't see a conviction when they looked at him. They saw survival. The local paper sat folded on his desk, Judge Harrison's stern face staring up from the justice section. Harrison to oversee high-profile Turner case, the headline declared. Marcus scanned the article. Another story about the judge's reputation for being tough but fair, his dedication to the letter of the law. Fair, Marcus thought, tasted bitter in his mouth. His office phone rang. The courthouse administrator wanted to discuss upgrades to their security protocol. Marcus switched to professional mode, walking her through his recommendations. The blind spots in the east corridor need coverage, he explained, his fingers tracing the blueprint, and the panic buttons in the judge's chambers are outdated. He paused, wondering if Judge Harrison would appreciate the irony. The man he deemed irredeemable now responsible for his safety. Evening found Marcus in the VA parking lot, his breath visible in the autumn air. Inside, chairs scraped against linoleum as veterans filed in for the support group. New faces mixed with familiar ones, each carrying their own invisible rucksacks of memories and regrets. A young woman in an army jacket sat in the corner, her hands shaking as she clutched a coffee cup. "My name is Marcus," he began, as he did every Tuesday. "And my story isn't finished yet." He shared his truth. The firefight that took half his unit, the pills that promised peace, the handcuffs, the courtroom, the denial. But tonight, he added something new. Sometimes the system that we fought for doesn't fight for us. But that doesn't mean we stop serving, stop protecting, stop being who we are at our core. After the session, Tommy lingered, clutching a manila envelope of court documents. Marcus sat with him, explaining terms that seemed designed to confuse, offering the guidance he wished he'd had. As they worked, news played silently on the TV mounted in the corner. Judge Harrison appeared briefly, stepping into his car after the day's proceedings in the Turner case. Marcus's phone lit up with a notification. Another courthouse had requested his services. He accepted the contract with a grim smile, knowing that every security system he designed, every veteran he helped navigate the legal maze, was a quiet rebuttal to Harrison's judgment. The conviction wouldn't define him, but it would fuel him. The night wrapped around the VA building as Marcus locked up, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Tomorrow, he'd be back at his desk, watching over the halls of justice that had shown him none. But tonight, in this moment, he was exactly where he needed to be, standing guard, in his own way, over those who still fought their private wars. The morning sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows when David Cooper walked through the metal detectors. His expensive suit couldn't hide the darkness under his eyes or the slight tremor in his hands as he placed his briefcase on the security belt. The guard barely glanced at him, just another familiar face in the parade of lawyers and clients that filled these halls every morning. Inside his briefcase, beneath legal papers and a half-empty pack of antacids, lay the gun he'd spent weeks smuggling in piece by piece. Each component had passed through security separately, disguised as innocent items in his daily visits. Today, the final piece made it through, hidden in the hollow spine of a legal textbook. Judge Harrison's courtroom buzzed with its usual morning activity. The clerk shuffled papers at her desk, while two lawyers huddled near the jury box, whispering about plea deals. A young intern struggled with an armload of files, nearly colliding with the court reporter as she set up her equipment. Cooper sat in the back row, hands clasped to stop their shaking. 6 months ago, he'd stood before Harrison as the judge systematically dismantled his life, awarding his ex-wife the house, the business, even custody of their children. Mr. Cooper has demonstrated a pattern of emotional instability, Harrison had declared, sealing his fate with a signature. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur. All rise. Court is now in session, the Honorable Judge William Harrison presiding. Harrison swept in, his robes flowing behind him like dark wings. He settled into his chair with the confidence of a man who'd done this thousands of times before. Cooper waited until the first case was called, watching the familiar routine unfold one last time. His fingers found the gun's pieces without looking. Each click of assembly was masked by the sound of legal proceedings, a defense attorney's objection, the scratch of the court reporter's machine, the shuffle of papers. When he finally stood, the weapon complete and cold in his hands, The world seemed to slow down. "Your Honor," Cooper's voice cracked. "Court is adjourned." The first shot went into the ceiling, sending a shower of plaster dust onto the American flag behind Harrison's bench. Screams erupted as people scrambled for the exits, but Cooper was already moving. He slammed the heavy courtroom doors shut, securing them with a chain he'd hidden in his suit jacket. "Nobody leaves?" The tremor in his hands was gone now, replaced by an eerie steadiness. "Judge Harrison, you remember me? The emotionally unstable one?" Harrison's face remained impassive, though a bead of sweat traced down his temple. 12 people remained trapped in the courtroom: the judge, his clerk, the court reporter, the bailiff, 2 attorneys, and 6 spectators. Outside, shoes squeaked on marble floors as people fled, and distant sirens began their wail. "Mr. Cooper," Harrison spoke with measured calm, "put down the weapon, and we can discuss this." Cooper laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Discuss? Like you discussed my case? Like you discussed my fitness as a father?" He gestured with the gun toward the floor. "Everyone on their knees. You too, Your Honor. Time for a new kind of court session." The hostages complied, their movements slow and terrified. Harrison knelt last, his judicial authority stripped away by the barrel of a gun. Outside, police radios crackled to life, and the first negotiator arrived on scene. But Cooper wasn't interested in negotiations. He'd spent 6 months planning this moment, crafting his own version of justice. What no one knew, as the morning sun climbed higher over the courthouse, was that Marcus Johnson had just passed through security in the East Wing, heading to help another veteran with paperwork. The day's true judgment had yet to begin. Marcus felt it before he heard it, the subtle shift in air pressure from the gunshot, a sensation that transported him instantly back to Kandahar. His muscles tensed as screams erupted from down the corridor, his coffee cup dropping forgotten to the floor. Beside him, the young veteran he'd been helping with disability papers froze, eyes wide with recognition of a sound they both knew too well. "Get out of here," Marcus commanded, his voice shifting to the tone he'd used as squad leader. "Use the service exit by the cafeteria." The veteran nodded, military training kicking in as he helped guide panicking civilians towards safety. Marcus moved against the flow of fleeing people, his security consultant's mind already cataloging details. 3 months ago, he documented every weakness in this building's security system. Now, those vulnerabilities flashed through his mind like waypoints on a tactical map. Through the chaos, he caught fragments of shocked conversations. Judge Harrison's courtroom, man with a gun, divorce case. Marcus's stomach tightened. He knew that courtroom intimately, had spent hours analyzing its layout, studying its blind spots, all while trying to forget the day Harrison had denied his clemency. Police cruisers screamed to a halt outside, their lights painting the marble walls in alternating red and blue. Marcus pressed himself against a pillar, watching the first responders establish a perimeter. Their radios crackled with scattered information. Subject identified as David Cooper, 12 hostages, demanding to renegotiate his divorce settlement. Through a side window, Marcus caught a glimpse into the courtroom. Cooper paced near the judge's bench, gesturing wildly with his weapon. Harrison knelt on the floor, his judicial robe pulled around him like spilled ink. The scene struck Marcus with its bitter irony, the man who judged him now being judged at gunpoint. A SWAT team assembled in the lobby, their commander spreading out building plans on a marble desk. Marcus recognized the layouts. He'd drawn them himself during his security audit. He watched them mark entry points, discuss angles of approach, all while knowing what they didn't. The ventilation shaft above the judge's chambers had been flagged for repair, but never fixed. The panic button under Harrison's bench had been malfunctioning for weeks, and the emergency sprinkler system in that courtroom operated on an outdated circuit. His phone vibrated. A text from his boss at the security firm. Courthouse situation. Plans needed ASAP. Marcus's thumbs hovered over the keypad, but the words wouldn't come. Everything he knew, every weakness he'd documented, every path to that courtroom, it all led back to one choice. He could walk away. Let SWAT handle it. Let Harrison face whatever judgment Cooper had in mind. Who would blame him? But as he looked through the window again, he saw more than just Harrison. He saw the court reporter who'd always smile at him, the clerk who'd helped him file his papers, the young intern who reminded him of his sister. The same code that had driven him to shield his unit under fire now rooted him to the spot. Through the window, he caught Cooper's eyes, wide, desperate, haunted. He recognized that look from his own mirror in the days after Afghanistan, when the world had seemed to conspire against him. Marcus pulled out his phone again, this time dialing the SWAT commander's number. His voice was steady as he spoke. "This is Marcus Johnson, Edge's Protection Services. I know this building's security system inside and out, and I think I know how to end this without anyone dying." Behind him, the morning sun climbed higher, casting his shadow long across the courthouse floor, a shadow that stretched toward the very courtroom where his own judgment had once been handed down. The SWAT command post hummed with controlled chaos as Marcus spread his security blueprints across a makeshift table. Officers leaned in, their tactical gear catching the fluorescent light as he pointed out the building's vulnerabilities. Every few minutes, their radios crackled with updates from the crisis negotiator, each report more concerning than the last. "Cooper's not responding to reason." The negotiator's voice came through. "He's talking about his kids now, getting more agitated. Says he's got nothing left to lose." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, remembering his own spiral after Afghanistan. That feeling of walls closing in, of a system that seemed rigged against you, of having nothing left to hold on to. He'd opened them to find the SWAT commander, Captain Rivera, studying him intently. "You're the one Harrison denied clemency to," Rivera said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, sir." Marcus kept his voice neutral, professional. "I'm also the one who knows every inch of that courtroom's security system." Rivera's radio crackled again. Through the command post window, they could see Cooper pacing past the courtroom's windows, gesturing with his gun as he ranted about corrupt judges and rigged systems. Judge Harrison remained kneeling, his usual authority stripped away, but his eyes followed Cooper with calculated attention. "We've got snipers in position," Rivera noted, "but the angles aren't clean. Too much risk to the other hostages." Marcus traced a path on the blueprint with his finger. "The ventilation system runs directly above the judge's chambers. I documented the access point during my audit last month. It's big enough for one person." He paused, letting the implication sink in. Rivera shook his head. "Too risky. If Cooper hears someone in the vents." "He won't," Marcus interrupted. "The old system groans all day. Background noise. Nobody pays attention anymore." He didn't add that he'd been the one who recommended replacing it, a recommendation that had been buried in budget meetings. A crash from the courtroom made everyone tense. Cooper had knocked over the judge's water pitcher, sending glass shards across the floor. One of the hostages, the young intern, began to cry quietly. Marcus felt the familiar weight of decision pressing down on him. Every instinct honed by military training told him this was the moment to act. But another voice, bitter and wounded, whispered that Harrison deserved whatever judgment was coming to him. He watched Cooper pace, recognizing the man's movements, the hypervigilance, the tight control masking inner chaos. "He's a veteran too, isn't he?" Marcus asked quietly. Rivera nodded. "Marine. 2 tours in Iraq. Lost everything in the divorce." The pieces clicked into place. Marcus straightened, decision crystallizing. "I can talk to him. Not as law enforcement, not as security, as someone who's been where he is. But I need to get close enough first." "You're not tactical team," Rivera objected. "This isn't your job." Marcus smiled grimly. "With respect, Captain, this is exactly my job. I protect this building. All of it. Even the parts I don't like." He pulled out his phone, showing Rivera the text messages from other veterans, men and women he'd helped navigate the system, find their way back from the edge. "Cooper needs to see a way out that isn't in a body bag. I can show him that path, but only if you let me try." Rivera studied the blueprints again, then looked at Marcus with new understanding. "You've already got a plan, don't you?" "Yes, sir, but you're not going to like it." Marcus began outlining his approach, each word carrying the weight of a choice, not just to save lives, but to rise above the very judgment that had tried to define him. Outside the command post, the sun reached its zenith, casting no shadows. The time for standing in darkness had passed. The ventilation shaft creaked under Marcus's weight as he inched forward on his elbows, thankful for the muscle memory from countless tactical crawls in Afghanistan. His earpiece buzzed with Captain Rivera's voice. "Cooper's getting more erratic. Whatever you're planning, do it soon." Through the metal grating beneath him, Marcus could see slivers of the scene below. Cooper had arranged the hostages in a semicircle, with Judge Harrison centered like a defendant before his own bench. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus as he watched Harrison's judicial composure crack under the weight of fear. "You ever lose a child, Your Honor?" Cooper's voice drifted up, thick with emotion. "Not to death, to paper. To words like unfit and unstable that you people throw around like they mean nothing." Marcus paused his advance, letting Cooper's words wash over him. He'd heard that same pain in countless VA sessions. The rage of warriors who'd come home to find their worlds unraveled, their struggles turned against them by a system that claimed to serve justice. The young intern's quiet sobs echoed through the courtroom. Cooper spun toward the sound, his gun hand shaking. "Quiet. I'm trying to make him understand." Marcus reached the position he'd identified on the blueprints, directly above the judge's chambers, where the vent widened into a maintenance junction. With practiced silence, he retrieved the small canister from his pocket, a modified smoke detector that would interface with the courthouse's outdated electrical system. "Team 2 in position," his earpiece crackled. "Ready on your signal." Marcus closed his eyes, centering himself like he'd taught others to do in group therapy. When he opened them, he spoke softly into his mic. "Cooper was 3rd Battalion, right?" "Affirmative," Rivera replied. "Why?" "Because I know how to reach him." Marcus took a deep breath, then pressed the button on his device. The courtroom's lights flickered, then dimmed to emergency settings. Cooper's startled curse echoed up through the vent. In the confusion, Marcus moved to the grate he'd identified earlier, positioned behind the judge's bench. "Hey, Marine," he called down, his voice pitched to carry authority without threat. "2nd Battalion, 5th Marines here. Let's talk about what's really going on." Cooper spun, gun raised toward the ceiling. "Who's up there?" "Just another vet who knows what it's like to have a judge decide your life with a signature." Marcus kept his voice steady, remembering his training in crisis intervention. "The difference is, you still got something to lose. You don't know anything about me. I know you're not a killer, Cooper. You're a father who's hurting. I see that 1,000-yard stare. I know that shake in your hands isn't fear. It's the same tremor I had when the pills stopped working." The gun lowered slightly. Marcus caught Judge Harrison's eye through the grate, saw the dawning recognition on his face. "They teach us to protect the innocent, remember?" Marcus continued. "Look around you, Marine. Is this who you are? Is this what you want your kids to remember?" Cooper's breath came in ragged gasps. I just wanted him to understand." "I know, but there are better ways to fight. Ways that don't end with you in a box or behind bars." Marcus shifted, preparing to drop down. "Let me show you how." Marine to Marine. The moment stretched like a tripwire. Marcus could feel Rivera's team tensing through the earpiece, ready to breach. But he knew, just as he'd known when to hold his fire in Kandahar, that this battle wouldn't be won with tactical superiority. Below him, Cooper's shoulders began to shake, and Marcus recognized the moment when a warrior chooses to lay down his arms. The next few moments unfolded like frames from a combat photographer's reel. Marcus dropped from the vent with the same fluid grace that had once carried him through firefights, landing behind Judge Harrison's bench. Cooper's gun tracked his movement, but the muzzle trembled with uncertainty. "That's far enough," Cooper warned, but his voice had lost its edge of desperation. The other hostages remained frozen, their breathing the only sound in the dim courtroom. Marcus kept his hands visible, his movements deliberate. "You know what they never tell you about coming home?" he asked, taking one careful step forward. "How the hardest battles happen in rooms just like this, with papers instead of bullets, with words that cut deeper than shrapnel." Judge Harrison watched the exchange from his knees, his judicial detachment crumbling as recognition dawned in his eyes. This was Marcus Johnson, the man he dismissed with barely a glance 6 months ago, now standing between him and a loaded gun. "They took everything," Cooper's voice cracked. "My house, my business, my kids. Do you know what it's like to have your own children told you're too dangerous to see?" "I do," Marcus replied softly. "Different circumstances, same pain. That's why I run those VA groups now. Because sometimes the only person who can pull you back from the edge is someone who's stood there before." Another step forward. Cooper's gun hand dipped slightly. "Your kids," Marcus continued, "they need their father, not a memory, not a cautionary tale, their father." He gestured to the hostages. These people, they're not your enemy. They're just caught in the crossfire, like civilians in a war that should have ended years ago. The court reporter stifled a sob. Cooper's eyes darted to her, then back to Marcus. How did you do it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How did you start over? One day at a time, with help, with purpose. Marcus was close enough now to see the combat ribbons still visible on Cooper's suit lapel. Remember what the court taught us about leaving no man behind? That doesn't end when we take off the uniform. Cooper's gun lowered another inch. They won't let me see my daughters. Then we fight that battle, the right way, through the veterans advocacy groups, through the system I help run now. Marcus extended his hand, palm up. But first, we have to end this day with everybody walking out of here alive. That's what a Marine would do. The silence that followed felt eternal. Judge Harrison watched as tears began rolling down Cooper's cheeks, the weapon becoming impossibly heavy in his hands. With a sound like a wounded animal, Cooper let the gun clatter to the floor. Marcus moved swiftly, securing the weapon while keeping his body between Cooper and the SWAT team now flooding through the doors. Easy, he called out to the tactical team. He's standing down. No need for force. As the hostages were quickly evacuated, Marcus kept one hand on Cooper's shoulder, grounding him in the moment. You're going to face consequences, he said quietly, but you're not facing them alone. Not anymore. Judge Harrison rose shakily to his feet, his robes dusty from kneeling. He stared at the two veterans, one he had condemned, one he had helped break, and for the first time in 20 years on the bench, he found himself completely without words. The morning's golden light had faded to afternoon gray, filtering through the high windows like a reminder that even the darkest days eventually end. And in that light, three men stood changed by a moment of crisis that had stripped away titles and judgments, leaving only their shared humanity exposed. 3 months after the courthouse incident, Marcus sat in a familiar chair before Judge Harrison's bench. The courtroom was different now, moved to the East Wing while they renovated the original space. But the real changes went deeper than relocated furniture and fresh paint. Harrison's desk held new additions, a folded Marine Corps flag in a triangle case, and a framed photo of him speaking at the opening of the county's first Veterans Justice Center. His reading glasses rested on top of a thick manual titled Understanding PTSD in Veterans, a Judge's Guide. The court has reviewed your petition for clemency, Harrison began, his voice carrying none of its former coldness. The past months had etched new lines around his eyes, softened the rigid set of his shoulders. Along with additional testimony from the crisis response team, the VA, and the veterans you've helped through your program. Marcus remained still, his hands folded in his lap. Through the windows, he could see the autumn leaves falling, marking another season of change. In the gallery behind him sat several familiar faces, veterans from his support group, including Cooper's wife and daughters, who had started attending family therapy sessions. I've been on this bench for 20 years, Harrison continued, removing his glasses. In that time, I've prided myself on following the letter of the law. But on that day, 3 months ago, I learned that justice without understanding is just another form of violence. He lifted a document from his desk. Your service record speaks of valor in combat, but it was your actions in this courthouse that truly demonstrated the meaning of courage. You had every reason to walk away, to let vengeance take its course. Instead, you chose compassion. Marcus thought of Cooper, now in treatment instead of prison, working to rebuild his relationship with his children. He thought of the other veterans who'd reached out after the incident, seeking hope in their own battles with the system. Furthermore, Harrison's voice caught slightly. Your continued work with the new Veterans Justice Center had shown that rehabilitation isn't just possible, it's essential. You've turned your own struggle into a bridge for others, something I failed to recognize in our first encounter. The judge stood, an unprecedented gesture of respect. This court hereby grants your petition for clemency. Your record will be expunged. He paused, then added, but more than that, I owe you a personal debt, not just for saving my life, but for opening my eyes. As Harrison signed the papers, Marcus noticed the judge's hands trembling slightly, the same tremor he'd recognized in Cooper, in himself, in countless veterans still fighting their private wars. Some battles, he'd learned, left marks on everyone they touched. Thank you, Your Honor, Marcus said simply, accepting the signed documents. No, Harrison replied, extending his hand across the bench. Thank you, Marine. Outside the courtroom, the Veterans Justice Center bustled with activity. New cases were being reviewed under guidelines that considered service-related trauma. Support groups met in renovated conference rooms. And in a small office near the entrance, a plaque read, Marcus Johnson, Veterans Advocacy Coordinator. Marcus paused at his office door, watching Judge Harrison walk past on his way to observe a veterans court session. The judge nodded in acknowledgement, no longer the cold arbiter of law, but a changed man who had learned that true justice required both courage and compassion. On Marcus's desk lay Cooper's latest progress report, a reminder that redemption came in many forms. Above it hung his Purple Heart, now accompanied by a new commendation for civilian bravery. But it was the photograph beside them that meant the most, his support group, standing together, their shadows growing shorter in the morning light of new beginnings.